Hi everyone, I'm Maggie McGrath, Senior Editor at Forbes. The Pew Research Center is out today with new polling around Americans' attitudes towards cultural issues ahead of the 2024 election. This new research shows stark divides in Americans' attitudes towards race, religion, immigration, and so much more. Here to explain all about it is Andrew Daniller. He is a research associate at Pew. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I just referenced how comprehensive this report is. Can you just give us the top line? What is the most important finding that you are releasing today?
Sure. Well, it's hard to point to a single finding that stands out above all the others, given how many issues we explored. But one that stands out to me and that I think is particularly important is our finding on immigration. We found that at this point, a majority of Trump supporters now say they support a nationwide effort by law enforcement to deport any undocumented immigrants who are currently in the country. And so that's a shift from what we found in the past, when fewer than half of Republican voters would say this. And so it stands out to me as one of the big findings from the report.
So a majority of Trump voters support deporting undocumented immigrants. How did Biden supporters respond on that issue?
So just 11% of Biden supporters say the same thing, say that they would support a national law enforcement effort to deport all undocumented immigrants. So that's a pretty massive gap between the two parties. It's close to 2/3 of Trump supporters, just about 1 in 10 Biden supporters. That is one of the larger gaps we saw over the course of this report.
And just for our understanding, as you look across all political parties and also independent voters, what percentage of Americans writ large support deporting undocumented immigrants?
37% of Americans. So that's about a third overall.
And how has that number changed over the years?
It has gone up a little bit over the last few years. This is something we've tracked going back since about 2017, I believe. And the number has gone up. Not steadily, it's gone up in jumps and spurts a little bit over that time, but one of the notable things is that back in 2017, fewer than half of Trump supporters actually said that they favored this. And so among Trump supporters specifically, among Republican voters, that's where we've seen the most increase.
Did they tell you why their opinions have changed here or why there's such an increase?
No, unfortunately, our data doesn't cover the why of this particular question. But what I think is noteworthy is that the Republican Party has moved at the elite level to supporting this position of engaging in deportations. And so we've also seen the same movement among the party, among the voters.
So immigration was an area that jumped out at you. There were other areas where I saw a 50-point difference between how Biden supporters felt and how Trump supporters felt, including on abortion and racial attitudes. Can you take us through some of the areas of the biggest divides?
Absolutely. So one of the areas that we looked at is, as you said, racial attitudes. And in particular, we asked people whether the legacy of slavery still has an impact on Black people in American society today. And this was an area where, as you said, there was about a 50-point gap. Among Biden supporters, something in the neighborhood of 3/4 of Biden supporters say that this does have a big impact on Black people today. Among Trump supporters, it's just about 1/4. So as you said, that 50-point gap, a pretty huge difference in how people see the impact of the legacy of slavery playing out in today's society.
Did that surprise you?
It's not necessarily a surprising finding insofar as we've long seen pretty big gaps on racial issues. But the size of it does still tell us a lot about the electorate today and about where the two parties stand.
And then another big area of divide was on matters of marriage and family and abortion. Maybe I shouldn't lump all those attitudes together, but I am the editor of Forbes Women when I'm not doing these interviews for Forbes TV. And something that really jumped out at me was the vast difference in people who said that marriage and family is important for society's success and those who say it's not. And that kind of fell along party lines. Can you explain what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so this was a question where we asked people whether it's better for society if people focus on getting married and having children and a family. And a majority of Trump supporters say that this does make society better. About 59% of Trump supporters, so a pretty sizable majority. Among Biden supporters, it's just 19% who say that this is better for society. So not necessarily saying that it's worse for society, just saying that there doesn't necessarily need to be the same emphasis on having marriage in a traditional family. And so that is a case where it seems like in their not just in their political attitudes, but in their more cultural attitudes, more social attitudes, there is a big gap between the two parties right now. We have a similar question that covers similar but not identical ground that asks whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for society that people today are having fewer children. And once again, on that question, we see the same kind of gap where Trump supporters say this is bad for society. Biden supporters are more mixed, say this might not be so bad, it might not be so good, but they fall somewhere in the middle.
Now, do you think people's answers to those questions help explain the wide divide on the question of the legality of abortion? Because here again, abortion was an issue where there was a nearly 50-point difference between Trump supporters and Biden supporters.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, unfortunately, our data doesn't tell us exactly why people support a legal right to abortion or oppose a legal right to abortion. But what we can see over time is that the parties have become a lot more polarized on the question of abortion. So today, as you said, there's something approaching a 50% gap where Biden supporters, an overwhelming majority, say that abortion should be legal in some or all cases. I'm sorry, in most or all cases. Whereas among Trump supporters, fewer than half say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So as I said, that's become more polarized over time. The two parties have moved farther apart over the last roughly 2 decades or so.
Now, on the issue of contraception, while we're speaking about reproductive health, contraception felt like an area where there's a little bit more agreement than in other parts of this survey. Can you explain what you saw there?
We asked people whether the widespread availability of contraception, including birth control, condoms, things like that, whether that's good or bad for society. And what we saw there is that majorities in both party coalitions, majorities of both Biden supporters and Trump supporters, said that it's a good thing for birth control to be widely available. Now, there was a slight difference between the parties. Biden supporters are a bit more likely to say this than Trump supporters, but it wasn't one of those large gaps that we've been talking about previously. It wasn't a place where there's a lot of distance between the two sides.
It's funny you say that because literally yesterday, a right to contraception act failed in the Senate along party lines on a procedural vote. So would you say that there is a difference in how regular Americans view this issue compared to how the government representatives view this issue?
Well, certainly based on what you just said, there seems to be a little bit of a distance between the majority of Americans who support that. But note that our question didn't ask whether there should be a federal right to birth control or anything along those lines. So the policy question is a little bit different than the public opinion question that we asked.
Generally speaking, because you bring up a good point, do people give different answers when you're just asking generally about an issue versus specifically about a policy on that issue?
Yeah, so one of the things that we really like about this report in particular is that we tried to focus on Americans' political values. So not getting into the nitty-gritty of policy for the most part, where the way that you could phrase a question might have a big impact on how people approach it. Here we tried to focus on what are the general attitudes, what are the very broad feelings about a number of issues that face American society today.
We are speaking, of course, during Pride Month, and Pew asked Americans about their opinions on gay marriage and other LGBTQ issues. What exactly did you find in terms of how Americans view gay marriage right now in 2024?
Yeah, so this is another case where there is a pretty substantial partisan divide. Among Biden supporters, we find that 57%, so a majority of Biden supporters, say that same-sex marriage being legal in the US is a good thing for society. Among Trump supporters, it's just 11% who say that this is a good thing for society. Now, the way that we ask this question, there is some middle ground. So everyone who said that this isn't a good thing didn't necessarily say that it's a bad thing. Some of them said that it's neither bad nor good. But with that said, there's a pretty substantial divide between Biden supporters who say that this is a good thing for society and Trump supporters who say that this is a good thing for society.
Those numbers seem generally low to me. And without having data from 2015 or 2014, before gay marriage passed in the US, I can't speak to the specific numbers, but how have you seen attitudes change over the years? Has support for gay marriage gone down in recent years?
So we don't have any evidence that support for gay marriage has gone down. This is a new question to us, whether same-sex marriage being legal is good for society. And that asks something a little bit different than whether you believe it should be a right or something along those lines. So as you know, same-sex marriage became legal a few years ago based on a Supreme Court decision. And that changed the way that we had to ask about same-sex marriage. However, what we saw in the years leading up to that was increasing support over time. And within the public opinion sort of industry, we talk about same-sex marriage as really one of those rare exemplar sort of cases where public opinion did shift, and it shifted rapidly, and that was something you could see happening as it happened.
And then you also asked about the use of pronouns, which is something that we have seen more and more in recent years. How do Americans feel about using they, them pronouns when referring to trans or non-binary individuals?
Yeah, so what we asked is whether in sort of your daily life, if you feel comfortable when someone asks you to use they, them pronouns instead of he or she pronouns. So we didn't refer specifically to transgender or non-binary people. It was just about using those pronouns sort of in your daily, your everyday life. And what we found there is that there is a partisan gap there, that Biden supporters are much more comfortable, or at least say that they're much more comfortable with this than Trump supporters are.
And here again, are those attitudes towards pronouns perhaps affecting how people view other LGBTQ issues like same-sex marriage?
Well, it's certainly possible. We have seen, of course, political leaders on both sides reference the pronoun debate, and so I have to think that that's playing into larger debates and larger issues when it comes to LGBT issues, when it comes to transgender issues specifically. Now, we did in this survey ask people whether the gender that someone is can be different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And this, of course, is another case where we see a very large partisan divide, where Republican voters and Democratic voters, at least those who say they're supporting the candidates currently, where they are far apart, where there are many more Biden supporters who say that the sex you're assigned at birth doesn't necessarily make you a man or woman, versus Trump supporters who say that.
Speaking broadly, across all of these areas in which there is a very large divide between Trump and Biden supporters, what is the likelihood that that divide narrows in coming years? Is it possible that Americans will become less divided or reach something closer to a consensus?
So asking to predict the future is something that we try to steer away from at Pew Research Center. I don't want to speculate about what might be coming down the road. I will say, of course, it's possible, but I do think that what our report shows is that there are some very fundamental divides on a lot of these issues. When you look at something like gun rights, for example, where for years we've tracked a very strong partisan divide, and where today something or in the neighborhood of 80% of Biden supporters say that gun ownership makes Americans less safe, whereas something like 80% of Trump supporters say it makes them more safe, it increases safety. I don't see that divide necessarily disappearing overnight. It's something where there seems to be a major issue that cuts to the core of political values and that people seem to have genuinely differing beliefs about.
So stark divides on guns, on abortion, on racial attitudes, on the legacy of slavery, on immigration. Is there any area in which Americans agree?
Yeah, so there actually was one set of items we asked about in this survey, and I won't say it was the only area of agreement, but one that really stood out to me. We asked people about policing and crime, and specifically what some of the priorities for law enforcement should be. And that's a case where we saw a great amount of agreement. So, for example, should it be a priority for law enforcement to ensure that communities are safe? Yes, absolutely. Most Americans agree with that. But even when it gets to a little bit more controversial issues, such as whether it's important to treat suspects fairly, regardless of racial or ethnic background, there's a lot of agreement that that should be a priority for American law enforcement. Or whether it's important to maintain respect for law enforcement. There is a partisan divide there. Trump supporters are a bit more likely than Biden supporters to say that this should be a priority. But overall, Americans think that this is important, and that's an area where there's some agreement.
And I think I noted there was also wide agreement on mental health. It seems like people broadly agree that discussions of mental health issues, mental health conditions, is a good thing for society. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. People seem to think that that's something that is better for society than when these issues were less discussed. And so the specific thing that we asked about is mental health and mental well-being, which can cover a lot of ground, I think. People aren't necessarily all thinking of the exact same conversations when we ask about that, but there's a very general belief that that's something that's beneficial to society.
So as you look across these issues where there's agreement, like mental health and policing, and even areas where there's disagreement, like racial attitudes and abortion and the ones we've discussed, what do you think the message to, I'll start with our presumptive presidential candidates. What is the message to Trump and Biden on these issues and how they should shape their messaging?
I don't think that there's necessarily one single message that tells the candidates what they should focus on or what they shouldn't focus on. What I do think this report does is show the wide variety of issues that are important to Americans as we approach the election. All of these issues are, of course, contentious. Well, not all of them. We identified some areas of agreement. Many of these issues are contentious issues, and they're issues where Americans don't necessarily agree. So from the perspective of the candidates, of course, they could say, oh, well, I'm well within what my base wants when I advocate for this policy. But it also helps to paint a picture, I think, of where the average voter stands and where there might be some areas of agreement, where there might be some areas where the candidates could potentially come to some common ground. But ultimately, this isn't about messaging. This report isn't about messaging. It's not about what the best way to win voters is. It's about where the voters stand and what ground they're on currently.
So what's your prevailing message about where voters stand and what ground they're on currently? What should our audience, what should policymakers, even maybe corporate leaders take away from this?
So it's almost become, conventional wisdom to say that Americans are divided, that there's a lot of political polarization today. But I think that this report helps to show that beyond just the cliche, beyond just the simple matter of divisions. I think this report helps to show where there are specific divides, where people have strongly held beliefs that conflict with each other, and they help to show us which directions the country could potentially go in, depending on which presidential candidate wins and whose supporters get the victory in the election.
Andrew, we have covered so much ground, 79 pages of it. Is there anything I've missed?
I think we've covered just about everything that I would want to talk about here. I'm trying to think really quickly. I won't say we've covered it all, but we've done a pretty good job, I think.
Well, maybe we'll have you back to go into some of the areas where we can go deeper, because this really is a comprehensive report on Americans' attitudes towards so many important cultural issues. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.